Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Tan Xiao Chin, and I'm moderating the 7th YouTube session of the 8th International Women's Edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 14 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. We'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. And you can find out more about the Pixel Project by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. Now, we have a very special guest for today's live Read for Pixels discussion and Q&A session, the fabulous fantasy and romance author, Charlie Ann Holmberg. And here she is. Welcome to Read for Pixels, Charlie.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, we are so happy that you were able to join us. Now, so as you all might know, Charlie is the Wall Street Journal and Amazon Charts best-selling author of The Paper Magician and Spellbreaker series. She's a Rita finalist and repeat Whitney Award winner, including for the 2020 Novel of the Year for Adult Fiction. She's also the 2020 Author of the Year for the League of Utah Writers. Born in Salt Lake City in the United States, Charlie was raised a Trekkie, next generation if you're interested, alongside three sisters who also have boy names. She's a proud Brigham Young University alumna and resides in Utah with her family and dog. Okay, so I know two of your sisters are Andy and Alex.
And my older sister is Danny. And they're all pretty androgynous names now, but they're all the masculine spellings because my mom is special.
Indeed. And aside from being with us here today, Charlie has also generously donated some awesome goodie bundles to the stash of author treats we have up as giveaways for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. She is offering 2 extra special Star Mother bundles, there you go, as treats for Read for Pixels donors in the United States. Each bundle includes 1 signed and personalized paperback set of the Star Mother duology, 1 audiobook CD set of the Star Mother duology, and a selection of bookmarks and postcards which are specially curated by Charlie herself. Now, there are only 2 of these bundles, and they are available on a first-come, first-served basis. So if you're one of Charlie's fans or a fantasy reader looking for something wonderful to read and or to listen to while supporting the cause to end violence against women, head on over and donate to our fundraiser on Rally Up to snag a bundle for yourself before someone else does. It's also the perfect 2-in-1 perk as you can keep either the paperbacks or audiobooks for yourself and give the other one to a fellow fantasy lover or Charlie fan. Or keep both for yourself. We won't judge. We've currently raised $2,077 towards our $5,000 goal. So please do help us keep the momentum going and give generously before the fundraiser ends on April 15th. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. If you're watching this session live on YouTube, you will also be able to ask Charlie questions right now. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen, and Regina, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to Charlie to answer. And now over to Charlie. What will you be reading for us today?
I am going to be reading a passage from Star Mother. So this is my newest series. This is the first book of it. And I wanted to share a moment of, honestly, strength but fear from the main character, which is something very closely tied into what we're trying to raise money for today. So in this book, the whole idea is that stars are the gods that power the universe, but they can only be born from a mortal mother and the sun god. And the main character becomes a star mother. They usually pass away, but she does not. But when she comes home, it's 700 years have passed.
Wow, that sounds interesting.
Yeah.
So the floor is yours, Charlie.
Awesome. Okay, so this starts shortly after her return, and she is not being treated well by the people from her village, and so she has decided to leave. On the 15th night, I again went to the cathedral to pray at sunset and once more knelt at the altar past nightfall. Father Aidan had taken to sweeping the floors just as he had at our first meeting, and when I could no longer hear the broom, I dared to rise early from my knees and peer behind me. I was blessedly alone. Taking off my shoes to minimize noise, I hurried deeper into the cathedral, easing open the door that led to the cemetery. I slowed only long enough to touch the wind-in graves, offering a final, silent, and heavy farewell before moving on. The walls surrounding the burial ground were short and easily scalable. I bounded over them and, under the cover of the waning crescent moon, cut through Endeavor back to the Aiden's house. This was the riskiest part of my plan, but I hadn't been able to conceive of anywhere else to hide my bags. The 2 parcels waited just behind the woodpile en route to the privy. I had stashed them one at a time under my skirt and tucked them away there. To my relief, both still awaited me. I pulled their straps crosswise over my chest and darted into the wood. It was the wrong direction for Terrasta, but I would change my route later. Right now, I needed to get as much distance between myself and Endeavor as possible. I needed them to lose me. These were my woods, where I had spent so much time with Cain. They, too, had changed over 700 years, but I knew these trees. I knew where to go. I hurried through the forest for an hour before the excitement of my escape loosened, as did the added energy it had given me. I slowed, picking my way carefully. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Had things gone my way, I would have hired a guide, not only to prevent me from getting lost, but because it was dangerous to travel alone, especially for a woman. I severely doubted that fact had changed during my extended time away. I ate some of my pillaged cheese to keep up my strength and peered up at the moon as I walked, trying to gauge when it would be safe to turn toward Terrasta. The spring branches were not full, but dotted with tiny budding leaves still discovering their place. I tried spying past them to find my star, and in my strain to do so, stepped on an uneven bit of ground and toppled into moist, weed-ridden soil, bags swinging around my hips from the fall. Pulling my foot free, I rotated my ankle carefully and said a prayer of thanks to all gods that I hadn't hurt it. Then the first wolf howled. My spine went stiff as an icicle. The sound was high and sorrowful and not very far away. Swallowing, I slowly stood, adjusting my bag so their weight wouldn't throw off my steps. I changed direction, walking away from the howl. Its answer came seconds later from the south. That one felt closer. I forced my breaths to stretch up and down my throat, forced my mind to think. I'd had little real exercise for nearly a year. I could hardly outrun them. They might not know I was there, but I knew better than to hope I could slip away unseen. Moving as quietly as possible, heart thudding, I shifted from scanning the shadowed way ahead to searching the trees, looking for one I could climb without injuring myself. I spied a promising pine when another howl sounded. Was it closer, or did my fear amplify its call? Setting my jaw, I reached the pine and grabbed the rough bark of its lowest branch, heaving myself up, adjusting my bags, and then heaving myself up again. Needles prodded my skin, but I ignored their discomfort. I would gladly take pine needles over wolves. I leaned against the trunk as I tried to stand. The next branch was almost directly overhead. I took off both bags and hung them from it before climbing up and up again, grateful I disobeyed my mother's rules about the boyish pastime of tree climbing in my youth. The howl stopped, but I heard movement in the forest now, the soft kind that stands out in the quiet of night when birds and bugs are silent. I straddled a branch, the bark scraping my thighs, and hugged the pine's trunk. Sap stuck to my arms and clothes. I blindly twisted my sun ring on and off, hoping the change of power might alert Sun that something was wrong. I never saw the wolves, but I heard more than one beast pass under my tree that night. Even when the forest quieted again, I didn't move from my spot, enduring the needles and the cramps. I think I dozed at some point, letting the bark imprint against my forehead in uneven patterns. It wasn't until after dawn, my limbs and back sore and shaky, that I finally climbed down. Using the sun as my guide, I oriented myself as best as I could toward Terrasta, constantly on alert for pursuers, both of wolf and human make. It took longer than I had planned to find the main road. Looking back, I think I overshot it by a couple of miles and ended up walking parallel to it for a few hours instead of perpendicular. Needless to say, I did not find a road through the wood until mid-afternoon, and I was so exhausted I found a thicket not far from it to lie down in, the brush thick enough that I was sure anyone searching for me would pass on none the wiser. I wrapped my second dress around me for a blanket and used my elbow as a pillow. I dreamed of my infant star, her body humming and glowing like suns, her fiery fingers tracing my palm. I whispered her name to her, but when I woke, I could not remember it. My eyes opened to dimming sunlight and 3 unfamiliar faces lurking over me. I startled, thinking a search party from Endeavour had come to drag me back to my worshipful duties. But though the town I had returned to was unfamiliar to me, I had seen its inhabitants at the cathedral every day for 2 weeks, and none of these men had been among them. They were well built, though thin, with mismatched, travel-stained clothing. One had tied a strip of fabric around his head. The other 2 held my bags. Told you she wasn't dead. The man with the fabric headwear stepped on my foot and slowly eased his weight onto it. My eyes darted to my bags. Please, I don't have any money. My mind raced to name what few valuables I had planned to sell in Terrasta. I have a compass, some woodwork, and we know. One of the other bandits held up his hand, which clutched my compass. The tombstone maker had given that to me as a gift. The first said, "We'll help ourselves to all of it." His eyes roamed up my legs. Hold her down. Fear slammed into me the same time the third bandit did, rushing at me while the first held my foot. I screamed and jerked away from him, but he pinned my shoulders down with a forearm and used his other hand to cover my mouth. I writhed under his weight and clawed at him, digging my nails in. He screamed and released me, cradling his arm. But it was not my nail gouges that had hurt him. An angry, long welt had seared his arm where his skin had touched my collar. "What are you?" the first asked as I wrenched my foot free and scrambled back. His eyes widened suddenly, and he tripped over himself to put distance between us for a friend to save me. It wasn't until the man croaked, "Spectre!" that I realized I was glowing. All of me that was uncovered, my nose, collar, hands. It wasn't a harsh, fiery light like sun's, but a soft halo, feathery and pearlescent. Godling! I didn't hear which one of them had said it, but I wasn't about to dispel the notion. If I was a godling, I would be more powerful than they. My assailants dropped my bags and ran for the road, cursing as they went, leaving me in a half-terrified stupor. I heard the retreating of horses moments later. My hands trembled. I stared at them until the glow receded and I was myself again, confused and cold and wrought with panic, feeling hungry in a way I couldn't explain. A dry sob scraped up my throat. I threw myself onto the ground, picking up the things they'd thrown in their haste and shoving them back into my bags. The bandits had taken off east toward Endeavour. I ran west. I ran and ran and ran until my lungs scorched and my legs ached. The darkness came on so quickly I didn't even remember the sun going down. But still I ran, my mind delirious, my body numb. Had it not been for the candle in its window, I wouldn't have noticed the farmhouse off the road. Sweat-streaked, limping, and panting, I dragged myself to the door and banged my fist against it. I don't remember who opened it, but I recall begging them to help me, and then I passed out.
Wow.
That's the end of chapter 8.
Yeah, cliffhanger. Yeah. Okay, so we'll hop on straight to our questions. And like Therese, is Star Mother, many of your books feature plenty of independent, resourceful female protagonists and supporting characters like Chiani Twill from the Paper Magician series, Elsie Camden from the Spellbreaker duology, and Anna Ryder from The Will and the Wilds, who are all complex and compelling women with agency who do their best with the cards they've been dealt with in life. What or who are your inspirations for your female characters?
Oh man, that's a good question. It's so interesting to hear that described that way, because it's like, isn't that all women, right? Like, aren't we all just so complex and dynamic people, and that's the whole place where the whole strong women, strong female character comes from, because you never hear strong male character, right? You hear strong female character because historically women have been written as very flat characters or very weak characters. And so, where do you get your inspiration? From real women. That's how real women are, they do the best with what they have. As far as my books go, honestly, I usually have an idea of the kind of story I want to tell. And I try to just pick the woman who would be best to tell that story. So whether she's an introvert or an extrovert, whether she's a painter or a contractor, or she's young or old or what have you, I just try to choose the woman who seems to fit this idea that I have for the story.
Yeah. And despite that, women are strong. You don't have to say strong women, right?
Amen.
But despite that, from what and according to what you mentioned just now, all genres, including fantasy, have their share of female stereotypes and tropes, many of which are sexist, misogynist, or one-dimensional.
Mhm.
So, how do you break stereotypes to create female characters with agency in dealing with the world around them, including situations that involve sexism, misogyny, and violence against women and girls?
That's a great question because I didn't always, it's just kind of funny to say
Mm.
being a female writer. I didn't always. My first book published was the 9th one I'd ever finished, and so people didn't see all the ones leading up to it. But because I grew up reading fantasy, and I grew up reading mostly fantasy written by men, especially epic fantasy, because it was very dominated by male authors, and so you kind of just think that that's what it is. Like, I genuinely used to think that I couldn't have a lot of women in my cast of characters because that was a bad book. Like, genuinely, I thought that. And I genuinely used to think female comedians were funny, dumb stuff like that. That's not true. What a wake up I had. But yeah, you just have to kind of learn it for yourself and think, well, how do I want to be written? And honestly, there are even times where I probably do fall into it without even thinking about it. And I have, fortunately, I have alpha and beta readers who help me with my books, and they probably have found stuff as well. But it's like, how do I want to be written? What would this book be like if it was a woman? And at the same time, I do feel like there's some, every person's different, right? Because
Yeah.
you can easily stereotype genders, like this is feminine and this is masculine, but you can have masculine people who do feminine things and feminine people who do masculine things. So really it just comes down to, what is this person like? Like, you can have the daring knight who fights dragons and then comes home, cooks his own meal, and knits, the stereotypically masculine versus feminine things. And there's nothing wrong with that. And like, I think that just embracing people as people is the best way to overcome stereotypes.
Mm.
I think
Yeah.
just looking at them as a person first and not in boxes that literature puts them in or that society puts them in, I think is the best way to do it.
Yeah, and well, it's interesting that you brought up, what you said about focusing on male characters first, because this is also something you said right during your Read for Pixels Ask Me Anything session on the Reddit fantasy thread back in August. So your comment here was that my first several books all featured men. The fantasy I grew up on prominently featured men. I subconsciously believed that I couldn't write a good story with a female protagonist, and how wrong I was. End quote. So what changed? What actually changed your mind and gave you the impetus to start writing stories featuring female protagonists?
Here's what's really funny, a precursor to that. So we have this thing that I've really been noticing in publishing and in literature, where there are definitely like strong women writing strong epic fantasies, but epic fantasies and like adult fantasies still tend to be very male dominated. And I think that's because the stories that women tell keep being relegated to YA, to young adult novels.
Right.
There are women who write adult novels, but then their protagonist gets just made 17, or 18 or 19, like the oldest you can be and still be, kidlit, and they get relegated into young adult. And I just think it's really funny because it's like, these stories are still good stories. They're still stories for people over the age of 18. But
Yeah.
I feel like women authors very often get relegated into YA. And the time that I first started writing female main characters was when I wrote my first young adult novel. So I always wanted to be an epic fantasy writer. And so I was writing all these really big epic fantasies. And then it was actually followed by Frost. It was the 6th book I ever written. It was my 4th book published. But that was my first foray into young adult novels. And I wrote a feminine story, the story I wanted to write. And I loved it. And it felt so much better than all of my other books. And it's like, oh, this is fun. Like, this is relevant. This is good. Like, I like this. I like this character. I like this story. And so I started just going that way is like I really thought like, well, someone will judge me if all of my books feature female protagonists. It's like, no. This is like, here, let me let you in on a little secret. Half the population is female. You know?
Well, horror.
You know, it's like I'm female. I don't have to write to men. Not to say that men can't enjoy my books. They absolutely can. Some have more feminine themes than others. But yeah, it's just like, why not? You know, and like, honestly, like learning more about feminism and how, you know, and all that stuff like that. It's like, why not? And I do have books now where I have male and female protagonists as well, but I'm like, oh, I'm a woman and I enjoy writing from the female perspective. So let's just keep going with that.
And you know, what advice can you share with fantasy authors who are struggling to write female characters?
Honestly, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. It's like, don't worry about whether or not they have boobs. Like, just write the person. Like, I've written women who were very masculine. I've written women who are very feminine. I've written women who are warriors. I've written women who clean houses for a living. I feel like when someone says, I struggle to write men or I struggle to write women, they're thinking too hard about the gender stereotypes. It's like, just write the person and don't worry about, you know, like, okay, well, how many masculine traits do they have to have and how many feminine traits, you know, like you don't really have to worry about it. So, yeah.
Right. And this is kind of a related question, right? So have you ever felt pressured by gender and cultural stereotypes to make your female characters likable or relatable? And do you ever get any flack for not making a female character likable enough?
That's funny. I mean, specifically female, no, because any book you write, you have to have your character likable in some way, shape, or form, or people don't want to read about it. Yeah. But we're going to talk about Followed by Frost again. In that book,
that was a bit controversial, wasn't it?
In that book, the main character's name is Smitha, and she has an enormous growth arc, and she starts out being very unlikable. She's like, she's super pretty and just super selfish. She's just a horrible person, only thinks about herself. And I've gotten definitely tons of comments of people saying, I almost put this book down, or people say they did put the book down. They wouldn't read that character anymore, you know, and understandably, because she's the worst. But, you know, so she wasn't a likable character, but that was because I wanted her to have room to grow. And she's a completely different person by the end of the book. And really, that's where so much relatability comes from, is from having characters that grow as opposed to having characters who are completely static, you know, because, I guess it's fun to pick up a book to read about this like super savvy, competent assassin who is super savvy going to kill all the monsters and super savvy saves the day. And at the end, he's just back where he was at the beginning, drinking his coffee and thinking about how super savvy he is. Like, sure, I'm sure it has like some exciting moments, but like, what did he learn? What did she learn? You know, I think it's all about the arc and the learning process for the character as well as for the reader as we follow that character through their story.
Definitely. Okay, let's talk a bit about relationships. So your books include a range of female relationships, including friendship, sisterhood, and rivalries that feel very real to many female readers. So what can you suggest for writers who want to write female conversations and relationships realistically or at least plausibly?
Okay, so this is a stereotype that I always really tried not to fall into because it was so common, especially in chick flicks. But you have this thing where it's just like the rival female mean girl. It's like, oh, we both like the same guy, so we hate each other, or we both want to get back like Victorian. I know how to say that word. And so we hate each other. It's like the women in the story always hate each other. You know what I mean? Like, especially I feel like any 90s rom-com, all the girls just hate each other. And so I really do try to avoid that. And then I'm sure you've heard of the Bechdel test. This is a test for movies, but it definitely applies for books as well. The Bechdel test being that at some point in the story, two women have to have a conversation with each other about something other than a man.
Yes.
You know, because like often, even today, like it's really easy to see in film because you can digest the film faster than you can digest the book. But there'll be like your one token female character. Like I just watched this fantastic action movie that there was one token female character in the whole thing. That's it. Everybody else was a man. Failed the Bechdel test. It was a great movie. I won't say it. I don't want to, I don't want to rain on other people's, work. But it seems so simple. Just like, oh yeah, you just have two female characters go talk to each other about something other than a man.
Yeah.
But you'd be surprised how many stories fail to do that. And so it's like, it's okay. Like I said, it's okay, younger Charlie. You can have multiple females in your book. It's okay.
It definitely is. Okay,
we're people too.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So I'm gonna go to a question from the audience. Okay, so we have a question from Misty306. Hi, Misty. Misty is one of our loyal audiences for Read for Pixels, right? She's always around. So Misty asked, Miss, especially stories about demigods, continue to be influences for modern fantasy stories. However, you are one of the few authors who have written about mortal mothers. Why did you decide to write about this mortal mother in particular, referring to Star Mother, of course?
Yeah. You know what? I mean, I relate to her. I'm gonna let you in on a secret. I'm not a god. I am a mother. I am a mortal mother. And so I definitely relate more to that aspect of the story than another aspect of the story. And honestly, when I got the idea for Star Mother, it was in Saris's voice. So I got the idea from a book that Kimberly Loth wrote called God of the Sun, which I actually have not read, but it was the original cover of the book and it has since changed. So if you go look it up, it's not going to look like this, but I don't know what it was. It was just the backside of a woman and it just said God of the Sun written over it. And something about seeing that, automatically the first lines of Star Mother popped into my head. And here, I can read them verbatim. I was like, here, let me butcher them for you, but I can just read them verbatim because I have this right here. Okay. Said, I thought making love to the sun was the most unbearable pain I would ever experience. Giving birth to his child was far worse. And I was like, whoa, like, where did that come from? I'm like, and that's what I was like, I have to make the lore and the world and the reasonings for why this woman would say this thing. And it was so interesting to me. Like, just her voice was the first thing that came up. Everything else was secondary. And so that's why I wanted to write about her.
Oh, amazing. Okay, well, since you talked about like a male-female relationship, we're going to hop on to that next. So male-female relationships between the main characters. Yeah, I mean, like, you're totally reading my mind here, Charlie.
I am a romance author.
Right. Okay, so the male-female relationships between the main characters in your books are generally quite equitable, and most of your male characters are respectful of women. Do you think reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways fantasy and romance writers can break away from harmful tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
Absolutely. It's funny because my husband was saying this just today. He was like, I can't remember, some guy did some awful thing. And he's like, it just makes me so mad because when enough guys, like a handful of guys do this thing, like it becomes the identity of all of us,
Yeah.
And it's like
one bad apple.
Yeah, it's like one bad apple. It's the thing is, like, most men are good guys, and I think we just have to remember that they are that way. And like, this might be slightly tangential, but it makes me think of Shannon Hale and about how she would share this story about how she would go do school visits, and she writes like these princess books and stuff, and they would only send the girls to the assembly. I was like, why they wouldn't send the boys? Because they were girl books, and it's like, because it's about a princess. It's like, I'll read a book about a prince, and so it's just, I feel like when we have these things, for lack of a better word, inflicted upon us from a young age, we just start thinking that way, and so I just think it's so important to teach kids that, it's okay to like the things you like and to do the things you do and to read widely and, to embrace these things. Because I feel like a lot of the toxic masculinity and stuff, it starts so innocently. It starts with telling boys they can't wear pink because pink is a girly color and pink isn't good enough, which means girls aren't good enough. It starts so young. And I feel like, I can't even remember what your original question was, but I feel like it's so important to be like so embracing of everything, because it's very typical for women to embrace the masculine, but not for masculine to embrace the feminine. Like if I shave my head and I want to wear boy clothes and go out, I'm just a tomboy. But if a man wants to grow out his hair and put on a dress, then like there's something wrong with that. Like why? What's the difference? Like what, he can wear a dress if he wants to wear a dress. I just think it's just this need for like equalization, just across the board. And honestly, if that equalization was there, then we wouldn't have to raise money for things like violence against women. So
Yeah. And speaking of, having stuff inflicted upon us from a young age, do you think that eventually the violent alpha male type character will phase out of the fantasy and romance genres as cultures worldwide start kicking out toxic masculinity? Or do you think it's one of those stereotypes that will stick around for much longer than expected?
I think yes and no. I think because everybody kind of likes to root for the big alpha male. And like I said, I am a romance author.
Yeah.
They're like alpha male romance stories, like are their own subgenre, and some people love reading those alpha male romance stories. That's just the kind of guy that they want. Or there are people, I know there are authors out there who have experienced trauma, maybe from a character, a person like that. And by writing stories similar to that, that's how they heal from their trauma. It's like, it's really interesting in how the psychology of all of it works. So, I think I do think you can be an alpha male without being a toxic male. Because take Aragorn. I watched a video on YouTube recently about how Aragorn from the Lord of the Rings movies is the perfect example of non-toxic masculinity, because he's so masculine, but he'll still weep for his friend who's hurt. He still respects the women. And it's like, you could almost call him an alpha male, but he's not toxic at all. But he's like the epitome of manliness, So the toxic kind, I think, will start to fade out, especially because we're becoming just so much more aware as people, honestly, about everything. But I do think that aspects of those are definitely going to stick around in certain genres, because that's just the kind of stuff people need to write, and it's the kind of stuff people need to read.
Okay. So many people in the anti-violence against women movement say that male violence is the main, if not the root cause of violence against women and girls, and of course, violence in general. How do you think stories and books like yours can help move the conversation forward in a constructive way?
I think it's like books like that, they humanize women, and it's like, well, obviously women are human, but we do have like this historical perpetuation of the de-evaluation of women, right? Where women are treated as objects more than they are as people. That's why most plastic surgery is done on women. That's why you turn on Dancing with the Stars and the man is fully clothed and the woman's wearing, very little. You open up a magazine and so many of the ads have scantily clad women, or the magazine just shows their body, their face is cut off. And that dehumanizes women. It turns them into objects, And so when you have female-centric literature, it's like, hey, these are real people. Like, we're kind of taught to objectify women, but the more we learn about, the dynamics behind women and like how multifaceted women are, the more we see them as people, and the more, I don't want to like put down men, but the more the patriarchy will see them as people, and again, starting very young, we're gonna just learn like we're all people, you know, and we'll stop. I feel like it's a lot easier to be violent towards a person that you don't see as a person, right?
Yeah.
And so as soon as that humanity becomes very apparent, then those awful things stop.
Yeah. I mean, because, like, stories are like totally one of the most powerful ways of bringing about social change, right? Because they can help change cultural narratives and perspective about social issues and traditions, like what we were just talking about, right? So, and the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in fantasy books, whether it's epic fantasy, urban fantasy, or paranormal romance. And similarly so for romance novels. Do you think that this is an issue that writers in both genres have started tackling successfully in recent years?
Oh, definitely.
Mm.
I recently went to it was a class on sex scenes. But
Okay.
the number one thing that the person drilled home was consent. Like consent every step of the way. Consent, 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 consent.
Mm.
Which I think makes for a very realistic book, because if
Mm.
we're getting it on, you know, in
Mhm,
real life,
mhm.
you know, you definitely want the consent there. I do think that there I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way. I do think there are ways of writing consent, like especially when you're in a character's head and you can hear their thoughts. You can like read the
Mm.
consent without it being verbalized, you know, because
Right.
when two people are getting it on, you didn't think I was going to talk about this. When two people are getting it on in a book, and every other sentence they're like, "Is this okay? Is this okay?" It pulls the reader out of the story, right?
Yeah. Yep.
But
Yep. Yep.
so that's where deep POV comes in. POV being point of view,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Where if you can be in their head and you see the consent instead of hearing the consent, then it's great. But it definitely is coming up a lot more.
Mm.
I'm really happy. Like, you read like romance novels written in the last just couple of years. It's so much nicer. You know, it's definitely like clearer, and their healthy boundaries are very, very much being
Yeah.
brought forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you have touched on violence against women in your books, right? So,
Yeah.
what would you suggest to fantasy and romance authors who wish to include such violence against women in their books?
As long as it's not fetishized, you know, as long as it's
Mm-hmm.
not glorified, I think it's fine, because I mean, whether your character is female or male, I mean, bad things happen. A lot of times
Mm.
bad things are violent. I mean, I literally just read from my book bad things happening
Yeah.
to a woman, but showing them being able to overpower those things, showing that violence as being, this is wrong, right? This isn't
Mm.
okay, because it can be glorified, right? You know,
Yeah.
like I think in a lot of video games, especially video games made 5 years ago and more,
Mm.
um, it's like, again, like the violence against women, the sexualization of women and everything is kind of, it's fetishized, and like
Mm.
these aren't real people. You can just go around and like hit whoever you want and sleep with whoever you want and blah blah blah, you
Mm.
know. And yeah, I mean, I would say, like, you don't need to never have any violence against the female character ever, because I mean the whole point of stories is conflict and overcoming conflict. Not that
Mm.
all conflict has to be violent, but if
Yeah.
that is the kind of conflict, that's the kind of story you want to show, I think it's really important not to fetishize it. I think it's
Mm.
really important to show the impact of it, because
Right.
I have read books where women were raped or almost raped and then they're just fine the next day, and that's not realistic
Mm.
at all. Like, if you're
Mm.
going to include something like that, you have to show you have to show the honesty of it. You have to show like
Yeah.
what it does and
Mm.
how it hurts and how they overcome that, you know. And I'm all about happily ever after, so of course I want to see the book end with the triumph of, you know. And so
Yeah.
yeah, you know, include it, but be honest.
Yeah. And okay, so this is coming from rather on the other side of the spectrum. How can author how what do you think, how I mean how sorry, in your opinion, how can authors strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about violence against women while telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
Ooh, without,
Mm.
yeah. The art of subtlety.
Yes.
Right, because I mean, so much of it is so subjective too. Because I've had books where I've had a book where somebody says this was amazing, like I really love the message in this, and then somebody else says like this was so preachy. She was just trying to tell me this, blah blah. A lot of it is really subjective, but I think a lot of it comes down to characterization. Because if you set up your character as a really well-rounded character and you make their motivations and their goals very clear, then every decision that they make along that way makes sense to their character. And it's like, oh, this is the natural growth of this character. Whereas like if they just turned around and were like, violence is wrong, and it's like, whereas it's like kind of like in your face. I feel like the in your face or the not so subtle is where it gets preachy, as opposed to being like subtle and kind of like, it's like, like leading a horse with a carrot. Because like there are people who won't pick up a book if they know that there are certain themes in it. Like, they're like, say, a man who doesn't want to read about, ending violence against women for but they might want to pick up a book about, magical dragons and knights and stuff. And oh no, there was a theme in there about respecting women,
Yeah.
And so I think making it has to be story relevant. It has to be character relevant. And then, I mean, and then the story speaks for itself,
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we're going to go to another question from the audience, and it's from Misty306 again. So, you've managed to become a successful writer by writing about unique fantasy stories. Any advice for aspiring writers?
As far as unique fantasy stories goes, I would say don't be afraid of your ideas, right? Don't, like, sometimes like you think of something like that's weird, nobody would want to read that, and it's like, no, write your weird stuff, like embrace the weird thoughts you have.
Embrace the weirdness.
Don't be afraid. Actually, and there's actually this thing, I mean, there isn't like a study done on it, but I swear if there was a study done on it, you have all these authors. There's a lot of authors out there where their debut novel or their debut series was incredibly successful, and their follow-up books were not so successful. And I really think that part of that, because obviously marketing comes into it and all that stuff, but I think a big part of that is when an author debuts, that is a book they wrote without any expectations on them. That is a book they're writing to their id, so to speak, like, your carnal desires, and like the thing that makes you happy. That is the book that you're writing. And when you write a book that you love, other people will love it too. As opposed to once you get into the publishing industry, it's like, well, I wrote a vampire book. Well, we want you to write more books like that. Like if you wrote an urban fantasy vampire book, now we want an urban fantasy werewolf book. But that's not what they want to write. Or maybe they wrote a young adult, now they want to write adult. And they're like, no, the publisher wants you to write young adult. And so you now have these expectations and these confines, and you're not really able to write your happy anymore. And it comes out, in the book. It's not to say the books won't still be good, but they're not nearly as successful as the debut books were because of those expectations. So I would say, regardless of where you are, like if you're published, if you're not published, whatever, write your happy, write what makes your heart sing, because if you love it, other people will love it.
Yeah, there you have it. Charlie and Holmberg says, write your happy. Okay. Oh, so let's talk about geek culture. So geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male-dominated, despite a rising number of prominent, well-respected, and well-known female authors, as we were saying earlier. Plus, there is still plenty of hostile, misogynistic, and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks. What do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books or movies, more welcoming for women and girls?
As soon as you say that, I immediately think of video games, right?
Yeah.
There was like a whole thing about that a couple of years ago about women being mistreated. What's really funny? I heard this thing from a podcast earlier today. It's a podcast called Shames of Sparkle. And they were talking about how people today grow up with all this technology around them, right? Whereas like when we were growing up, when you interact with a person, you did it like face to face, like you didn't text, you like went over to their house. And if you said something hurtful, you could see on their face how that affected them. You could see that was hurtful. You could see that was wrong, and you learned that. And all these kids growing up now, like everything is done digitally where you don't see people's faces. And it's like, there are generally people out there who will leave a hateful comment on someone's post and not realize how hurtful that hateful comment is, And so I think, like, honestly, I think it gets better when more women get into geek culture. There's so much, I mean, workforces in general tend to be very male dominated, but like the whole video game thing is very male dominated. A lot of, I was talking earlier, adult fantasy is very male dominated. Once more women get in there, like, we're gonna, like, you can't do it anymore. Do you think like a guy in a room full of women, like one guy in a room of 50 women is gonna make a sexist comment to one of them? No, because you're in the lion's den, I just think that we need more opportunity for women, that women need to take the opportunities they want, like not to be afraid of them, and grasp it and insert yourself there. And I also think that we need all those good guys out there to stand up and say something when something misogynistic or sexist is happening, especially because like I could tell a guy, dude, that wasn't okay, and he doesn't care what I think. But if my husband told him, dude, that's not okay, then maybe it gets through that skull of his, which is unfortunate that that's a thing. But when you have like those kind of people, you kind of have to speak their language. And I think the more we pursue this and the more we integrate into their society, the less it's going to happen. And, our upcoming generations who are being raised this way, it won't even cross their minds to include misogynistic things or to say that awful thing to somebody.
Yeah. And that ties in perfectly to my next question. So, parents are usually the most influential role models in a person's life. As a mom yourself, what do you think parents can do to help prevent violence against women and girls in future generations and to get boys involved in helping to do so?
Like I said earlier, I really think the gender stereotyping does a lot of it. One thing that I've tried really hard to do with my son, so I have a daughter and I have a son. Something I try really hard to do with my son, it's like, if he wants to wear pink, he can wear pink. If he wants to wear a dress, he can wear a dress. If he wants to play with a Barbie, he can play with a Barbie. It's okay. Like, and because your gut reaction is like, oh no, don't do that. That's like, but again, when you tell him like, you can't have Barbies, that's a girl toy. You can't have pink, that's a girl toy. It's like, oh, girl is bad. And that tells him, oh, I'm more than the female experience. I think starting very, very early on with that is so important, so that they're, you're not like, and parents are not doing that on purpose, right? But it does kind of teach that one sex is less than the other. And I also think being very open about books, like, let boys read about princesses. It's okay. It's like, let them do a report about Princess Diana if they want to. Like, let them embrace these things. And, it just starts from a young age. And my son's best friend is his sister, and that's so good. And, my daughter had a birthday party recently, and one boy came to it, and I was worried, honestly. He came and like, oh no, he's gonna be so bored. No, he was having a blast coloring in his flying cats and wearing the cat ear headbands and everything. And I was talking to his mom afterwards, and his mom said that he said, I'm just more of a girl boy than a boy. He just that's how he described it. He just likes playing with girls because they're nicer. It's like, that's fun. Like, you don't have to only play with boys. Like, all my elementary school and junior high, I only hung out with girls, and the boys always hang out with the boys. It's not until those puberty hormones kick in that we start crossing barriers. But, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I have I have a 4-year-old niece, and sometimes the culture is so insidious, right? So she came up to me and was like, "Oh, okay, pink is for girls, and blue is for boys. You're a girl, so you should like, pink is for you." Then I look at her and I said that, "But my favorite color is blue." So I don't know whether I've totally blown her mind or just totally confused her. Hopefully,
Yeah.
it's blown her mind.
And you know what's so funny is that, like, in the early 1900s, pink was considered a masculine color.
Yes, and
We
that
just
was
saw it
exactly what Regina
somewhere.
was saying in the chat box.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay, and well, we've actually arrived at our final two questions for this session. Cool. So you have been so incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. So this might be a bit of an obvious question, but why do you support the cause to end violence against women?
I mean, like, you get asked something like that. It's like, because I'm human, because I am a woman and I am human. And I feel like any sympathetic human with half a
Mm,
conscience out there
yeah.
obviously would never support the harming of women, but it's like, it's scary how common it is. I think it's really easy when you live in like a little pocket of the world or under a rock, so to speak, that it's
Mm,
easy to think that those things don't happen. I remember when the Me Too movement started, I was just, what? Because here
mm,
in my little pocket in Utah, like, I've never been sexually harassed, or my friends haven't been sexually harassed, but this is 1 in 4 people. And it's just like, I feel like so many of us think, well, if it hasn't happened in my experience, then it doesn't happen, you
mm,
know? And with so many topics and so many situations going on, it's like, well, if I haven't seen it, then it's not real. And
yeah.
that's not true at all.
Yeah.
And I worry that is a mentality that a lot of people have, especially people who live really privileged lives. And I mean, especially like violence against women tends to happen in lower income areas too. And
Mm,
so we have these people who have the means to help, to donate, and to support charities like this one, but who are completely unaware because it's not their life, you
yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And I just think, if we all just became so much more aware of each other and each other's problems, if we could see the warning signs, if we could understand what it's like to be hurt, to be abused, to be cast aside, to be raped, that everybody would take a stand for it. Like, everybody
Mm,
right now is taking a stand for Ukraine because we all know about Ukraine,
mm-hmm.
right? But
Yep.
I think despite the fact that it's gone on for centuries, I
Yeah.
really genuinely think a lot of people don't realize it's still going on today. And there are even cultures out there that it's totally normalized
Mm,
to, smack your wife around or whatnot.
mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so the more awareness we can get to it, the more help we're going to be able to get. And women who are in these situations might finally have a chance to get out.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, aside from writing stories, what do you think that authors can do specifically to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
I mean, yeah, stories is a big part of it.
Mm,
I've seen a lot of them donate to auctions for different charities to help raise money for it. A lot of authors have platforms. All authors have some kind of platforms, but there are definitely ones that have bigger platforms than others. And
yeah.
using those platforms to do good, to share message, even if it's just retweeting something that Reading for Pixels, tweeted, like, just doing your part to share and to educate. I
Mm,
mean, isn't that what we're here for? Even like, I'm over here writing about sexy demon men coming out of the earth, but I mean, fiction is fiction, but like we said, like there are themes in fictions, there are morals in fictions, there's growth in fiction that you can use to educate. And just, again, I feel like awareness is such a critical aspect of it. So as authors, I feel there are people you don't like, people I don't know read my books,
yeah.
and so you're reaching people you don't even know about, that you don't know their name, you don't know their face, you don't know their situation. And so
Mm,
being able to have positive literature out there,
mm,
it's just such a fundamental thing to a prosperous society.
indeed. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to put up some comments from the audience. So again, from Misty306, this was in reference to what we were talking about earlier, right? Put Sanderson, Martin, Abercrombie, Pullman, etc. into a room. When Hobb, Jemison, Kwang, Okafor, etc. walk into the same room, they hold the doors open for them. Yes, and this is I think Misty's in the US as well. So in elementary school, we were supposed to sit at tables assigned by classroom. For some reason, my peers sat at the two tables by sex. We did it on our own, and we still don't know why. Cultural prevalence, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and she says, thank you for the advice and for answering my questions.
You're welcome.
We also have one from Megan Belcher. Yay, go Charlie! Great conversation.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to put myself back on. Hi, everyone. So thank you, Charlie. That was an awesome session. And
Thank you.
so for the audience, in case you missed the beginning of our session, we are excited to let you know that Charlie has not only generously spent her time here with us today, but also donated 2 extra special Star Mother bundles as treats for Read for Pixels donors in the United States. Each bundle consists of 1 signed and personalized paperback set of the Star Mother duology. There you go. 1 audiobook CD set of the Star Mother duology, and one selection of bookmarks and postcards specially curated by Charlie herself. Now, there are only 2 of these bundles, so if you're one of Charlie's fans or a fantasy reader looking for something intriguing and romantic to read involving gods and mortals, conflicts, and travels across time and the heavens, while supporting the cause to end violence against women, do donate to our fundraiser on Rallyup to snag a bundle for yourself before someone else does. It's also a perfect 2-in-1 gift, as you can keep either the paperbacks or audiobooks for yourself and give the other to a fellow fantasy lover or Charlie fan. There are also plenty more goodies available on Rallyup from other Read for Pixels authors and partners, including Alaya Dawn Johnson, Angela Yuriko Smith, Jeff Kennedy, Juliet Marillier, Lauren Willick, Linda D. Edison, Eloisa James, Matt Gardiner, Sujata Messi, Zank Books, Page Street Publishing, and more. New goodies will be released every week throughout March, so do check back to see if anything you may want pops up. Now, let me share this slide. There we go. Okay, so you can donate to get these goodies on Rallyup at tinyurl.com/r4p Rallyup IWD 2022. It's case sensitive, so make sure you type in the capitals. And if you want to learn more about Read for Pixels and our past and upcoming author sessions, go to bit.ly/readforpixels. We have raised $2,077 towards our $5,000 goal so far, so please do give generously before the fundraiser ends on April 15th. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. Now, we also have something else to share. Here we go. So, the Pixel Project has also produced our very first charity anthology titled Giving the Devil His Due, where the Twilight Zone meets Promising Young Women. It's available for order from major booksellers worldwide, including Amazon, Kobo, Google Play, Book Depository, and more. And as a bonus for early bird buyers, we have teamed up with 12 of the 16 authors to offer an exclusive limited edition anthology bookplate. Each author will sign 16 bookplates, and they will be given out on a first-come, first-served basis. Each bookplate also includes a resource for domestic violence and sexual assault victims and survivors in 205 countries. So if you know anyone who might be in such a situation and who could use some help, this might be a pretty good gift to slip to them. For more information about the anthology and how to score a bookplate, visit bit.ly/givingthedevil.history. All net proceeds from the sale of this anthology go towards keeping the Pixel Project's campaigns, programs, and initiatives, such as this one, alive and kicking. To find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. Now, Charlie, I believe you have some announcements for us?
Yeah, so I just wanted to announce that this book, Starfather, came out on March 8th. So it's my newest book, and it is out there now. You can get it at your local library. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on my website, charlieandholmberg.com, and sometimes at Barnes & Noble. And I'm also going to be at the Storymakers Conference in May. I believe it's May 12th to the 14th, and virtual tickets are still available.
Okay. Well, we've come to the end of our session today. Thank you everyone for joining us and for asking questions. And have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world.